Welcome to a quick discussion of Metroid: Samus Returns. Released in 2017, this was generally seen as a return to form for the franchise after a series of missteps. 5 years later, I wanted to talk about how well it's held up and highlight its history. Metroid: Samus Returns is a reimagining of Metroid II: Return of Samus, originally released for the Game Boy. In general, the plot is largely unchanged, where Samus is sent to the planet SR388 to eliminate all Metroids here, but the actual level design and aesthetic are completely different. In general, this game was really well received when it released, but was also somewhat controversial at the same time. And there's actually quite a bit of history to why that is. So, at the time, the Metroid series was kind of dormant. There were two games within the past, several years for the franchise, but both weren't particularly well-liked and sold extraordinarily poorly, all things considered. In 2010, there was Metroid Other M for the Wii, which is considered one of the worst Metroid games for its story and portrayal of Samus. In 2016, there was Metroid Prime Federation Force, a 4-player cooperative spin-off to the Prime games, utilizing similar gameplay, but with a mission-based structure and with objective-based gameplay designed around co-op. So at this point, the Metroid franchise was not in the best shape because both games underperformed. Metroid Prime Federation Force in particular sold really badly, given the relative success of the 3DS at that time. So yeah, things weren't looking great for this franchise. So around the time of the series' anniversary, Metroid fans actually worked on a remake of Metroid II called Another Metroid II Remake, or AM2R. I want to say this was actually in development for a really, really long time, but released around the anniversary, I would say in August 2016, if I'm remembering right. It was available for a few days before the project received a cease and desist from Nintendo and was delisted. Obviously, it's the internet, so if you look hard enough, you can definitely still find it, and other members of the community are still working on adding, or at least for a while, we're adding to it, even though the original developer of AM2R moved on to other projects. I'm pretty sure he ended up working on Ori and the Will of the Wisps. So yeah, AM2R was shut down, and that definitely made Metroid fans not happy because it wasn't like Nintendo was doing anything with the Metroid franchise at that point, or at least that's what we thought. And then a year later, at that E3 2017, not only was Metroid Prime 4 announced, but Samus Returns was also announced at the Treehouse showcase of that E3. Getting not only a new Prime game, but also a new 2D Metroid was a big deal after such a long break for the franchise, and a lot of really questionable decisions in terms of the overall direction of the franchise. So yeah, overall, this game was well-liked, but the shutdown of AM2R definitely did cast a shadow over this game's release. There are still, to this day, debates over which is actually better, with some preferring AM2R and others preferring Samus Returns. I know another thing that didn't help this game's pre-release cycle was actually its developer. This game was developed by Mercury Steam, who had previously worked on the Castlevania Lords of Shadows games, which weren't exactly well-liked installments of that series. I've actually never played those, even as a Castlevania fan. I've never gone around to them, to be honest, even though they are readily available on Steam. At some point, maybe I'll try them, just to have an opinion on them, but they never felt like a huge priority to me. But I've heard very mixed things about them. Specifically the 2D one, Mirror of Fate, and then Lords of Shadow 2 are very disliked. So yeah, going in, there was a lot of skepticism over Mercury's team handling the next Metroid game. But overall, they definitely did an okay job with this game, and then eventually went on to work on Metroid Dread, which released in 2021 and was a big deal as the first new, like brand new 2D Metroid game since Fusion in the early 2000s. I really like Metroid Dread a lot. I like it a lot more than this, and in hindsight, that's actually part of the reason why I feel like this game in some ways, while still enjoyable, definitely feels a little bit dated. So for example, the Mercury Steam Metroid games tend to emphasize combat over exploration. So for example, in Super Metroid, you have a much greater emphasis on basically exploring the environment and finding secrets. The amount of actual like combat is much there's a lot less combat in that game compared to the more recent games. I almost feel like Fusion was the start of the emphasis on like action in Metroid and moving away from exploration as the game started to get more and more linear from that point on. Other than like Zero Mission, which was a remake of Metroid 1, but even that had more like more direction than the original Metroid 1. So yeah, I basically like all of the 2D Metroid games pretty evenly, I'd say. Like, I don't know what my favorite would be. It might be Zero Mission, mostly because of nostalgia, because that was one of my earliest 2D Metroid games. But I also really like Metroid Dread. I like this game a lot. I like Fusion a lot. I think Fusion is my second favorite 2D Metroid game, and then Dread. At least that's kind of how I'm currently feeling about the franchise. And then Prime is kind of in its own category. It's a very different style of Metroid, but I still like those games too. But yeah, Samus Returns I do enjoy, but it definitely has some elements to it that I'm not the biggest fan of. Mostly it's combat. So in this game, Samus has the ability to melee counter enemy attacks. So when you see the little spark from enemies, that's kind of your signal that you can counter that attack. But it's actually not very useful in some cases, because in this game, every time you counter, Samus stops moving. You have to be standing still to counter, which is actually kind of annoying. Metroid Dread fixed this problem by adding the ability to move while countering, which definitely helps the flow of movement in that game. Honestly, I do think Metroid Dread has some of the best traversal in the series. It's just much more linear, so even though the traversal itself is really cool, it doesn't feel like you're actually exploring a ton on your own. It's still fairly guided. I say as someone who got absurdly lost playing Dread, because I missed a breakable block in one room. So it is still possible to get lost in like the more recent Metroid games, but the chances of getting like really turned around to the same degree of something like Super Metroid is much smaller. So yeah, there are definitely like different styles of 2D Metroid games now, and I'm kind of okay with anything at this point. I am curious to see what happens next with this franchise, considering it took like 20 years to get Metroid Dread as a true continuation of the franchise. I definitely think the game delivered for the most part. But another thing worth mentioning is I feel like it'll be a while until we get another 2D Metroid game, but it's actually kind of fascinating to me that we've actually gotten 2 2D Metroid games in the span of Prime 4's development. So yeah, Prime 4 was announced at the same E3 as Samus Returns, and that still hasn't been released yet. At the time of this recording, I have no clue when this will actually happen. Depending on like when this video goes live, it could already have been announced by now, like if there was a Nintendo Direct in early September, but if not, then who knows. That also ties into another thing. I actually was planning to play through a bunch of the Metroid series leading up to Prime 4, but I actually never did because Prime 4 restarted development. So if anyone was actually wondering, like, back in the day when I was planning to go through all the Metroid games in chronological order, starting with Zero Mission and then working through, like, Prime and hopefully getting done by Prime 4, that's the reason why I never got to, like, Prime 2, was I didn't really have to rush because it's not like Prime 4 was coming out anytime soon at that point. So yeah, at some point I would like to actually continue to go through the Metroid series, like the full series. I have no clue when that'll be, again, because of like so much of this franchise being in limbo at this point in terms of development history. Again, this might age very poorly, depending on if there was a Nintendo Direct before this video goes live. Another problem with the Mercury Steam Metroid games is, I think, a little bit rooted in how they got the job, actually. So they originally weren't going to remake Metroid 2. The original pitch was to remake Metroid Fusion instead. And I definitely feel like there are remnants of that in the design. Like the linearity, though to be fair, Metroid 2 is also a somewhat linear game. But the thing that stands out the most to me in terms of that like design philosophy is the damage output. So like Fusion is known for having really damaging enemies and attacks, and that definitely carries over to this game. It's definitely one of my biggest issues. There's not like an easy mode or anything that actually makes the enemies deal less damage. Prime actually got an easier difficulty as a free update, which is actually a very good call if you ask me, because that game was very punishing. And yeah, that kind of started with Fusion and carries over to this game in Dread, where, yeah, if you struggled a lot with like Metroid Fusion in terms of like combat and everything, yeah, this game is also pretty difficult at times. And yeah, that carries over to Dread. In a way, it's kind of enjoyable in its own way. I definitely got frustrated a lot playing both games because of certain boss fights, but in general, I do feel like both games have very like rewarding combat. So once you actually like master all of the mechanics, it can be very fun to get through fights a lot more easily. But specifically in the case of Dread, one of my biggest issues with that game is simply forgetting moves, basically. Like in Samus Returns, you have a slightly different problem of the 3DS doesn't have like 2 shoulder buttons by default. It has one set, basically. Unless you're using a new 3DS, which this game was not exclusive to, and thus you are confined to the original DS's control setup, which basically means that you basically have, like, it'd be nice to have other buttons used for this, and Dread, for example, used every possible button on the Switch controller. So in this case, that's also similar to Samus Returns, but you just have fewer buttons to work with. So like, equipping beams is on the touchscreen, which I'm not the biggest fan of. Like, having to swap beams in the middle of a fight is very tricky when you're having to like use the touchscreen and kind of like shift your focus away from what's actually like the main action to basically swap beams. I want to say Dread actually stacked beams like in other Metroid games, so I actually think that was a much better way to go about that, to be honest. Another thing worth mentioning in terms of this release being slightly controversial was its amiibo integration, where basically a harder difficulty was actually locked to an amiibo. So there was a 2-pack of a Metroid amiibo and Samus, based on her Samus Returns design. I wanted to say the Smash Bros. Amiibo give like missile and health refills, but like the Fusion mode, as it was called, was exclusive to one of these amiibo that were for the game, and are now extraordinarily expensive. In all fairness, again, this game is very difficult, so even though I missed out on the amiibo, I never felt like I missed out because I never felt like the game was too easy. I definitely struggled a lot to the point where I didn't really want to play with like you know, taking double damage or whatnot. So yeah, in general, even though I do fully believe that it's not great to lock a gameplay mode behind an amiibo, like an optional difficulty behind an amiibo, I can't say I exactly missed that when I played through it, because again, it's difficult enough as is without having to worry about fusion mode. But yeah, it definitely was kind of annoying having that locked behind amiibo. But yeah, overall, it didn't bother me as much just because I wasn't personally interested, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a bad decision. Another weird decision about this game was the Switch was already out at this point, and yet this was actually for 3DS. I kind of hope someday, because like Miitopia got a 3DS remake, part of me hopes that like this game and some other 3DS games will eventually get remakes as well, because I think this game would really shine on Switch compared to 3DS. Like, a lot of the environments don't really stand out very well because of the smaller screen. And yeah, in general, I feel like the game does hold up pretty well visually, but definitely is constrained by the hardware. So yeah, in general, I do really like this game still. It's just kind of held up poorly in hindsight because of how good Dread is, in my opinion. A lot of the gameplay changes in Dread would also be nice to see if they ever decide to remake this game, like being able to move while countering. That would definitely improve my opinion of it, and also maybe add in like the amiibo fusion mode as just an unlockable instead of like an amiibo locked mode. Also maybe adding in an easier mode too, because again, I definitely, as someone who can definitely get through the game no problem on its default difficulty, nowadays, it definitely was a challenge on my first playthrough, and it definitely makes the game a little bit less accessible because of how difficult it is. So having an easier option would actually be nice. By the way, this game also introduced the Aeon system, where we have Aeon powers to like scan the environment and also perform special attacks later on. This was also brought back for Dread. Going back to this game, it actually feels a lot more conventional in regards to item placement. Like, we got the scan pulse like really early on, and not to go into too much detail because of it's still not being that old of a game, like under a year at the time of this upload. One thing I really liked about Dread, actually, I know this was very polarizing, but Dread has a really bizarre item order that I actually really liked. I actually like not getting standard items until much later, because you kind of have to think outside the box a little bit, and also that affects the level design and how you have to approach certain areas if you don't have like moves that are pretty standard to the series, and it's very interesting. Yeah, in general, I do still really like this game. I actually don't know how accessible it is. I mean, the 3DS eShop is being shut down next year, so in terms of digital, it won't be available for too much longer. I don't know how expensive physical copies are. I don't think this game sold amazingly well, so it's probably somewhat rare. But if it ever gets a remaker, if you happen to find it, I would actually recommend this game. I do enjoy it quite a bit, even though I definitely do prefer like some of the other games like Dread or Zero Mission, which I hope, in the case of like Zero Mission, again, this might age poorly if there's a direct before this video goes live. I would like to see like Game Boy games like Fusion and, or Game Boy Advance games like Fusion and Zero Mission eventually make it over to the Switch. But yeah, I think that about sums up everything I had to say about Samus Returns. So thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.